Hello, friends. Today I had the pleasure to talk to my own father, Bas van Os, who has a PhD in theology, and he is an expert on the historical Jesus. So I went through basically the historical evidence for Jesus with him, but we did so in a story-like manner. So we kind of went through his life, or at least the Gospels, in a chronological manner, and then he would add some of his expertise, which was, to me, like one of the most exciting ways in which I've interacted with the story thus far. So like I was in flow state during the conversation. It was super engaging, and I hope it's the same for you guys. I think sometimes, especially religious stories, we take them for granted in the sense that we don't really realize the gravity of them. And I think for me, looking at it from a historical perspective, even when I was a kid, it would make it much more alive for me. Like I would really have to contend with the reality of it. And so I hope it does the same for some of you. And if you want to find my father's work, I will link it down below, and some of our previous conversations as well. Have a lovely day, everyone, and I'll see you guys for the next one. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm joined by my father, Bas van Os. How are you doing, sir?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you for coming on. Such late notice. I've been thinking a lot about the story of Jesus. You have been thinking a lot about it as well, as reflected in your work. And I recently just started really becoming more conscious of the fact that it's like such a tragedy in many ways. And I started to feel the reality of that suffering more and more. And I started to really be intimate with it and to really come to grips with what it means to believe in the reality of that suffering, and to believe that it was the best of us that went through that, and that in many ways, that's what it means to believe. So yeah, you are someone that's, I think I could call you an expert on the historical Jesus. And therefore, I just like to ask you some questions, because I think a lot of people, including perhaps myself, if I had not known you, but I had been exposed to Peterson and the like, who are often speaking about Christianity and religious ideas in terms of the perhaps the psychological aspect of it, or the symbolic aspect of it, where you're kind of like able to believe a lot of these stories because symbolism, or because psychologically it makes sense. But I think with this one specifically, the even the material reality of it is very important. The historical reality of it is essential. Um, so yeah, I want to talk with you about that, and then I want to also go into the actual depth of the meaning of the reality of it. Um, but so yeah, I think where should we start with this? Um, for someone that's kind of like interested intellectually in religion, in Christianity, and who's basically got this idea of Jesus, of like, yeah, this is symbolically a story that makes a lot of sense and I can understand it. But the resurrection and him actually being God is perhaps a step too far for me to believe in material ways, or in, yeah, I don't know which word to use here exactly. Um, what do you say to someone like that if you can get like a lot of time with them? Like, because I've had university classes um, where, they'll tell you bluntly that like there was a guy, with this name, and if you would go with the historical method into these questions, you would come to the conclusion that there's a reality to it. Otherwise, you might be ignoring evidence. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus was a historical figure.
So can you maybe like introduce him if you were like more of a historian, and like maybe we can do it in that sense, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, may I do one step first before we move
Perfect.
to it?
Yes.
because you started with psychology and Peterson and the symbolism of psychology. And I think that's a very fruitful way, but I did it the other way around. That means that I have been working in the Society for Biblical Literature in the group that's called Biblical Psychological Criticism or Hermeneutics. And I published a book on psychological analysis and the historical Jesus. So that's very much in that area. I don't know if it's here somewhere, but
It is. I know it is.
oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
So this is, I don't know if you can see that or that it gets.
We can see it very well. Shameless plug.
So that is a book that I made to understand the psychological impact on Jesus. And now let me make a theological point here. Before we go into dogmatism about is Jesus God or is he not God? Was he resurrected from the dead or not? The key thing why Christianity, why Jesus' message spread among his friends and his friends were able to spread that into what we now call Christianity, is that it worked on a psychological level. His faith worked. So understanding his faith from a psychological perspective is incredibly useful to understand what it could do for us now from a psychological perspective.
Yep.
And that's not an avenue that many historical Jesus scholars take. Most of them were concerned about finding out, that's the big project of German theology, finding out what we can know for certain about Jesus.
Okay.
Later historical criticism is more about putting Jesus in his right context, his Jewish context, but you can add a number of contexts to it, his gender, his class, etc. So you can do a lot of stuff that fits really well with the discussion today in academia that can help you understand what Jesus is doing, or for instance, disabilities and how he's dealing with sickness, etc.
Yeah.
But theologically, the big impetus was that it is the faith of Jesus that is sort of paradigmatic for us. This is there was a big book on this by Hayes about the fact that we kept on translating in the Greek that faith in Jesus saves us. But often it says there, the faith of Jesus saves us, which means either the faith that Jesus had or faith like Jesus had.
Yeah.
You get it?
Yeah.
So even if you don't believe in Jesus as God or as resurrected from the dead, it is his type of faith in his Father, trust in his Father, or his conception of God as a loving Father, that was revolutionary, and that works on the deepest level. So understanding the psychology of the historical Jesus helps us to understand the psychology of religion, and we can use psychology of religion to understand the psychology of Jesus and his followers. Mind you, I am blaspheming now in academia because since Schweitzer, we have said we're not going to do psychology of Jesus anymore. Because most of the time we are reading into Jesus what we wanted to find.
I see.
Okay.
And why do you still do that? Like, what is your response to that?
Twofold. One, yes, absolutely correct. So you need to be methodologically very sound if you want to do something useful there. But B, even if you deny that you're doing it anyway.
Yes.
If we read books about the historical Jesus, we read about his motivation or his powers of persuasion, and that's all psychological.
Yeah.
So denying yourselves the tools of psychology because you should not psychologize Jesus also means that you're an amateur in that field.
Yeah, I think it relates to this idea of objectivity, where science tries to be objective, but it comes to grips with the fact that it can't be. And I mean, archaeology even is something that it's not fully a hard science, is it?
No,
Or
no,
like,
no, 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 no.
history either. Like you're
Hard
always
science,
telling,
material sciences, but it is history.
yeah, and history is a
And history
story.
has its own rules.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe that's good also. What does a historical theory do? A historical theory tries to make sense of what we can observe.
yeah,
It tries to give the best explanation, but it has to be an explanation. And then if there are several explanations possible, it will choose, that's Occam's razor, it will choose the most,
Plausible.
sorry, yes, my order is wrong. So the second would be the most plausible, but if two explanations are equally plausible, you would use Occam's razor and use the most simple plausible explanation. Now,
Yeah.
the problem that we did with the historical Jesus is that we're not really explaining the evidence, but we're trying to say something about Jesus. So the whole historical enterprise of the historical Jesus is sort of methodologically unstable because people want to explain Jesus. But he's not observable. So rather than explaining Jesus, you should rather explain what we see, for instance, in the letters of Paul, and ask yourself, what kind of Jesus could produce this response?
What do you mean with what kind of Jesus?
So you've got the object of study. What are you studying? What are you trying to explain? And you've got the method by which you explain. Yeah, you've got the explanation itself. Now, most people think that historical Jesus studies is about Jesus as the object of study, but we can't observe him, so we cannot study him. What we can study is the early church.
Yeah.
And then the Jesus that explains that early church, in as much as Jesus should explain it, it can also be that later developments should explain it, but in as much as the historical Jesus should explain it, the historical Jesus is a theory, is a theoretical construct meant to explain that Paul is saying certain things about Jesus.
Yeah.
That's a completely different way of looking at the whole historical Jesus debate. Most people are saying, was he raised from the dead? Good.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Who saw him
Yeah.
come up from the dead?
Yeah.
Oh, no. We only have a letter of Paul that has a certain context. And later we have stories in the Gospels that have a certain genre and context. So first understand that before you talk about was Jesus raised from the dead, you should rather say, what can explain the fact that Paul writes in his letter to the Corinthians about the resurrection of the dead, it invokes Jesus' resurrection as an argument why he still believes in the physical resurrection. What can explain that?
Yeah.
You see, because if I'm just saying, did Jesus rise from the dead? I can invoke biology or physics and say, well, that's not possible. Discussion closed. But that doesn't explain how it got into the letter.
Yeah.
So I need to find something that explains what happens in the letter. So I first need to read to be able to I need to learn to read that letter.
Yep.
And then later on, I need to learn to read the Gospels. And what you often see in discussions about the historical Jesus, they say, well, he didn't do the miracles that we see in the Gospels. But the Gospels are literary works afterwards. And we should not say, well, because they are literary works, they cannot be factual. No, we should explain from the first step, why did Jesus get a reputation such that people read these Gospels as biographies of the historical Jesus? There is Burridge's work on the genre of the Gospels, which I think still holds. And it basically tells you that people thought, even people who had known him or had known people who knew him, thought this was an acceptable way of describing his life.
Mm.
That's an interesting question. That is a scientifically sound question.
Okay. So this is already a good background thing to start with. Right now, what I'd like to do, I think what would be interesting, you also wrote a book about sort of like a first person perspective on Jesus, which I think can really help to get yourself a bit closer to the story. I'm not necessarily asking you to do that right now, but maybe I'd like to ask you to tell me about him. Maybe as a child growing up, what is this scenery? Because I know you do that very well to like sketch what it's like in terms of environment, people, um, and what it looks like.
Yeah, so now I have to make a distinction between what we know and what we can imagine.
Yes, you
We
do that.
cannot know that much for certain, but let me first sort of elaborate a little bit on what we know. Okay, things that are beyond discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Jesus was a Jew, lived in first century Palestine. He was crucified under Pilate, Governor Pilate, Pontius Pilate. He was the prefect at the time for the Romans, and prefect in terms of very much to make certain that the province was kept in order,
Mm.
kept in check, law and order. We know that he became a follower of John the Baptist. That's pretty reliable. We know that he, after the arrest of John the Baptist and John's execution, Jesus became increasingly popular as a teacher in his own right and as a miracle worker or a healer. That's pretty much beyond dispute that he had that reputation. We know that he had friends, and he said they were 12. That's a funny way of saying, we know he had friends, and he said that they were 12. That's because we believe that there was something of a symbolism in the number of 12 that he employed. We're not certain that he had exactly 12, the same 12 disciples all of the time. You can read the Gospels, and you can work your way around a little bit around the different lists of names, and you could come to that idea, but you don't have to. Historically, I think it's more safe to say we know that he had friends, and he said that they were 12 because 12. And there was something eschatological, that's returning to the end times, that was both in the preaching of John the Baptist and in this symbolic act. We also know that he was at one point crucified, probably under the rubric of a rebellion or sedition, a king of the Jews, what have you. And we know that his friends afterwards claimed that he had risen from the dead.
So that's what we know.
That's, well, you could add a few things, but you
Yeah.
get more and more about imagination and less about certainty from a historical perspective. And this is the old quest that said we have to find out what we can know for certain about Jesus. I'm more interested in what kind of Jesus explains why so many people followed him, made these communities, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm looking for an expansive Jesus, a Jesus that we allow to be the product of our imagination.
Yeah.
So you want to go there?
Oh, absolutely. I have one question though before we go there. The 12, the symbolism of the 12. Do you have any idea about that?
12
Why?
tribes of Israel.
Sorry, go again.
12 tribes of Israel. The
Okay.
big the great yearning was under the Romans, but also under the Herodians, and even before that, that the mythical Israel would be restored, being the 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes that were carried out, exiled by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, that were spread across the world, or the then known world.
Mm.
And people were yearning for a restoration of Israel.
And so this symbolizes some sort of, well, yeah, restoration is a good word. A returning back to a unity of some sort.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go into the expansive.
Okay, so the expansive for me, because now I'm talking about my imagination and not yours or not someone else's. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is how I experienced that Jesus, and indeed writing in the first person and the present tense as much as I could find about him, is a sort of blasphemous way again to to start imagining what's going on. And I'd like to come to a picture that is able to include as much of the material that we now have as possible. So I'm happy with miracles and whatsoever, although I'm not someone who would forego the desire to have at least some plausibility. So when we're talking about walking across the water, over the water, I would go to the texts and I would look at the first text, which is in Mark, Matthew, and then first in Mark, and then I see a fisherman's tale.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, it's present in all the Gospels, even in the Gospel of John. So, wow, if it wasn't impossible, it's one of the stories that you would normally want to have. And when you allow yourself to go into the question, how did these fishermen tell these stories, even though later more theologically oriented people wrote them in a literary form with all kinds of mythological motives, as we had in that talk with Graham Dempsey. If you allow yourself to think about that, you start entering the field of the imagination of the historical Jesus. So let me just take this example, because it's a good example. We're basically at the moment that John the Baptist has been decapitated. So he no longer has his head. Jesus has taken up his message. So the message was, while Herod is fighting for his kingdom and he wants to expand it, take over perhaps a role in his father's kingdom, the whole of Israel, which was Herod the Great's kingdom, John simply said it's God's kingdom. And then when Herod marries Herodias, his niece, and John says, you cannot have your brother's wife, then he is arrested. And at that point in time, Jesus picks up his banner. So he picks up his banner exactly at the point that his mentor is arrested and in jail.
Ah,
So
that's
it's a
interesting.
fine fact.
Yeah, yeah.
And he says, it's God's kingdom. Convert and believe the gospel. And that's the moment that his friends, some of his friends whom he already knew from the days with John the Baptist, he says, come follow me. And that group then carries on with the message of John the Baptist. Now, John, of course, is brought to a desert fortress, Machaerus, where Herod is holding a party, perhaps for his 60th anniversary or for so many years of his reign or what have you. And Herodias, his new wife, is still angry with John, and they are politically afraid because John carries a lot of moral weight. And some political events are happening that I find extremely interesting, but I won't bore you with today. But anyway, so
Well, it seems quite interesting. You can gloss over it if you like. I
yeah,
find
but
it
I'm
quite
going to go
intriguing.
into an area that people disagree with. Well, only a few people disagree with me, which is the suggestion by Nikos Kokinos that Herodias was married to Philip, the
Ah,
ruler of the eastern part of the kingdom. So that means the Golan now and Jordan and southern part of Syria. And that he died, and that therefore his wife tried to hold on to his inheritance by making an alliance with Herod Antipas of the Galilee and asked the Roman emperor to grant them the joint territories. The problem was that Herod Antipas, up until that date, was married to the daughter of the Arab king of Nabatea, Petra. And she felt that she was pushed over when Herod Antipas married Herodias. So she fled via Machaerus, via that same desert fortress, to her father in Petra. And her father had a historical claim to those same territories. His ancestors had ruled those territories as well. So there is perhaps a territorial conflict between Antipas and his father-in-law, and his father-in-law was far more powerful.
yeah.
He had a bigger army. So I won't bore you with the story that unfolds, but let's go
Well, I
back.
find it really interesting.
Yeah,
Go
yeah,
on.
we'll get there. But
Okay.
let's go back to the moment that Herodias because that's so this story that I'm telling you is very much disputed, because Kokkinos comes with this later date of Jesus' death, and
Yeah.
most people don't accept it. So I can bore you with it, but it's
Okay.
sort of at the moment still a fringe theory.
Yeah. Good.
Anyway, so what we do read in the gospel story, which is extremely old, it has these Aramaic words in it in Mark, is that she contrives to have John the Baptist's head chopped off. And then his disciples go up north to Galilee to tell Jesus. And Jesus is at that area around Capernaum with his friends proclaiming the gospel. And now, what happens if the one person that you took the banner from is killed? What does that do with your sense of political security?
Yeah.
You run for asylum?
Yeah.
That's probably, so there's a lot of fear there. But anyway, he decides to cross the lake and get out of the territory of Herod Antipas and into the territory of the deceased Philip, I believe the deceased Philip. And there, a lot of people are joining him. And the Gospel of John, which is the latest Gospel, explains that they wanted to make him king, which is a very political act. So they said, this is the limit. Herod has killed John, our prophet.
Yeah.
Rise up. So this is the moment that we really have to consider whether a man like Reza Aslan is correct that he says Jesus was a zealot and a revolutionary.
Mm.
So what happens, by the way, this is when the grass is green. So it seems that that year, Jesus didn't go south to Jerusalem for the Pesach celebrations, but they were around Pesach, they were in that area. And people wanted to make him king. So what does he decide to do? And we get the story of the feeding, the 4,000, 5,000. It's in every story, and it's wholly theological. So in the Gospels, it becomes a completely theological story.
You know, I wanted him to become king when I was reading it for the first time. So I understand the tendency to,
Yeah.
you know, I think it's to reflect on it a little bit. I think it's like a general yearning for people to want to solve everything with the political.
Yeah.
But he transcended that.
Yeah.
I think there's great wisdom in it. But yeah, go on.
So you have this story about the feeding, and everybody is talking about, did he feed so many people or not?
Yeah,
That's not the interesting
that's the
part.
point.
That is the theological way of expressing how he stands in the tradition of Elijah and Elisha. And perhaps something happened there that people started to share. Perhaps even a miracle happened. I don't care. I mean, that's all possible. But I would like to know then how. Was it possible that the miracle was that people started to really share, and before that they kept everything to themselves? Or
Yeah,
I don't know what the miracle was. But the point is, that's not what happened politically, and it's not what happened with him. With him, in the end, he sends the people away. He does not accept the kingship role.
yeah,
So that's the first thing that happens. And then he sends his disciples to go back across the lake while he withdraws into the mountain. So probably he knows that if he, well, I'm now speculating too much perhaps, but that he needs to get rid of the people, basically.
yeah.
If he wants to go back to Capernaum, where Herod Antipas rules, he needs to go there quietly. It also says that he wanted to go and pray to be with his father, so there may also be a faith element in there that's going on.
With whom? With his own father?
With Jesus. So
Yeah.
Jesus has this request of becoming king, and he says no. But is there then a faith element that goes on that he needs to go in prayer? Possibly. Anyway, the wind was against the ship now, and it seemed that they didn't get ahead. Now, where we are located now is basically the north side of the Lake of Galilee. So they're moving from the east to the west, but not across the lake, but along the lake boundary, the northern boundary of the lake. And it's weird, but they see Jesus as passing them by, as if he cannot go to them straight. So you're here, and it seems that Jesus is overtaking you in that direction. He seems to be passing them by.
Yeah.
Now, I'm also a materialist. Could he be just walking on the shore?
Yeah. Could be.
It seems like he's walking on the lake because they are in the lake and it's like this, and they see this figure on the shore passing them by. It
Yeah.
could be, I don't know. The weird thing is that the story is expanded in different ways in the gospel. So in Mark, they take him on board. That's nice. But in Matthew, you have this whole story with Peter coming out of the boat and then saying, I can do this, I can walk on the water. And then he walks a few steps and then he almost drowns and Jesus gets him out, etc. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Matthew that we don't find in Mark. But what's most exciting when you go into that story is that when John is telling it, he says, oh yeah, but when they wanted to take him on board, they hit the land where they were heading to, as if they were near to the coast.
Yeah.
And we know from archaeology, you asked, is archaeology an exact science? But we know from archaeology that the piers of Capernaum jutted into the sea, like this. So you have the northern shore and the piers like this. Who cares? The funny thing is, if I'm just a theologian, I will only look at the mythological and the language and the meaning later on. But if I'm interested in the historical Jesus, I can say, well, I cannot use this story because there's a miracle in it, or I can start thinking what could produce this story.
Yeah. So what could?
And what kind of man is Jesus now?
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that they actually thought he was capable of doing weird stuff. That's why the story held.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem he's doing any weird stuff, not to me at least, but because I could explain it in very simple ways. But in terms of fisherman tales, the story is easily expanded to really weird stuff. And we do believe it's historically credible that people were actually healed by him. So you can read Donald Caps's work on the conversion disorders, is what he calls it, and why people, for instance, cannot walk or cannot see as a result of psychological illnesses. So it might very well be that Jesus indeed had a reputation for doing marvelous things. Now, as a person, he was obviously loyal to John the Baptist. Otherwise, he would not take the risk of taking this up. He was brave enough to stand up when John was arrested, and careful enough to flee when he was executed.
Yeah.
And it seems that after this episode, he actually goes north, and then you've got the stories around the Syrophoenician woman, and you've got story near to the mounds at Caesarea Philippi, etc. So from a historical perspective, it makes perfect sense that he needs to flee and find out what his situation is. What kind of man is this? It's a man who is seemingly unmarried, who is capable of having relationships with female friends, that they travel with him, which was not very common unless it was in larger groups, for instance, like the pilgrimages to Jerusalem. He was capable of bonding with men, even men who were already married. We know, well, at least the stories are that, for instance, and Peter had a mother-in-law. So there's no reason why that would be fabricated. We know he was a believing man, that he longed that God would be king of Israel, and we know that he was cautious enough, or not enough of a megalomaniac, to start an uprising.
Yeah. So this is where we are in the story. Um, can you continue it like where, you stopped with explaining the water scene, for example? Um, because I quite like this angle you're presenting of it, and including the political. So what happens next? Let's say.
Okay, well, so then there is this story early in the Gospels that it seems somewhat out of place there because it's the early harvest, and Jesus seems to be fleeing because he uses a story of you can take even on a Sabbath you can take some of the corn from the field because you can look at what King David did when he had to flee King Saul.
Mm.
He took even the bread from the from the sanctuary and gave it to his friends because they needed to eat. And then after that, you find him in Caesarea Philippi, no, in near Sidon and Tyrus, Lebanon.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want a woman who's calling after him. He doesn't want the people to know that he's there. He wants to keep it silent. So I would say there's a good chance that, yes, this political situation made it necessary for him to flee. But it would also be existential. Now we get to psychology again. Because suppose that John did indeed say, well, you have to take over from me. I'm, I'm, I made the path, you walk it. Huh? And then he walks it and he gets this situation and he flees his calling because he feels restrained to take up this armed fight. And by the way, John the Baptist never engaged in an armed resistance, at least not as far as we know. So what happens there is that Jesus may have been thinking about what is my calling? What should I do? Should I return to Israel? Am I called to liberate Israel? What am I doing in a foreign country? And exactly that story with that woman there, then she has to convince him that the bread is not just for the children of Israel, but also for the dogs around the table. So she compares herself to the dogs around the table so that he would heal her child. And he is amazed by that. So it could very well be that this woman puts a seed into his thinking about his calling that says, aren't you here for the dogs as well?
Mm.
Of course, we always say, well, we reflect from it afterwards, after the church had gone out into the whole world, to all the nations, etc., which is the big mission. Go out into all the worlds and make everyone into my disciples and baptize them. But that's how we read. If we assume a story that could produce this, there might be a nugget in this story that says he started with the ideals of John the Baptist, but they expanded somewhat,
Yeah.
and perhaps came to include other prophecies, like the prophecies in Isaiah, where it is prophesied that also the nations will be drawn to the God of Israel. Now, that will be a gradual development then, which is normal and human. So it's a very human and materialist view that I'm proposing here, if I'm imagining the life of the historical Jesus, that nevertheless led to the symbolic Jesus that he is there for the whole world.
Yeah, but it needs to have that in a sense. Like, you could say the woman talks to him and plants the seed, but it's in my mind, of course, it has to happen some way. And then in retrospect, you could see that it makes sense symbolically as well. But
Yes.
it's this way of thinking of like, well, if she plants that seed, then what if she wasn't there? That's
Mm.
that's often like the atheist questions always like, but what if this, what if that? But like, it's not true. It wasn't like that. It was like this. And so, if you understand reality in a meaningful manner, then you could say um, it was supposed to be like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's the big question. Was he a haphazard accident of history? For instance, what if the Romans had not killed him?
Yeah. See, that's the what if, but it's like it's the story, you know. Like, there's a reason that we remember the story for so long, and it's because everything went according to how it must have went in order for us to, you know, it's like it's a loop in that sense.
Well, our reality is today, exactly. You're absolutely right. Our reality is today, and it can only be explained by what preceded it. So if this is the reality and we do not want to be just one of parallel universe of realities.
Yeah. See, this is where we're always going, is like, well, what if human beings were not the, you know, the evolved species? What if we were all frogs? It's like, okay, funny.
Well, but I do believe that if you look at the universe and you look at the different arguments for some kind of creator,
Yeah.
then one of the arguments is the fine-tuning argument. Another argument is that this universe led to the development of life, of consciousness, sentient beings, and even to love. So if God is love and that is the design principle, then of course it has to lead to that.
Yeah.
Now I'm a believer. I cannot prove this is beyond any physics or theology, or I mean theology it could be, but
Yeah.
I'm not doing that at the moment. I'm just simply a believer. I'm myself, and I'm just believing that God has something to do with this world. And I think that God is love. And I think that if you look at this world, then the development of light, life, and love is exactly how this world was meant to be. But yeah, that's me. There's
Uh,
nothing.
it's beautiful. Let's return to the story. So you were saying the woman, and then the
Okay,
seeds
so
were planted.
yeah, and then we get to some fuzziness in the present state of the Gospel of Mark. Stories also that Luke doesn't use, but Matthew has. So there's some questions about what would be in the original story of Mark. Did Luke leave them out, or did Matthew add them? What were the two additions, etc.? So there's this whole bunch of theories about how that could come about. But in the end, after these episodes, we do end up in the north of Israel, or actually the south of Syria, the Mount Hermon. It's we don't know where it was, but
Yeah.
one of the Gospels at least says it was near Banyas, the present-day Banyas, or Caesarea Philippi, and that is the present upper north of Israel, near to the Mount Hermon, where Jesus kept talking with his disciples about him having to die. Now, a lot of theologians say, well, that's just the church reading that into him and giving him these predictions. And of course, we cannot be certain that he actually did it because it happened. Because it happened, we cannot know that he predicted it. If he had predicted it and it had not happened, we would be pretty certain that he had predicted it. And
Yeah.
you see,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that sort of thinking doesn't give him much chance for success, huh?
Yeah. He's
But
too perfect to be realistic.
yeah, but when you read, for instance, the about the life of Martin Luther King Jr., then um, then you read that he sort of feels when he's going to be murdered.
Yeah. Yeah.
He knows tension is building. He feels it in his gut.
Yeah. And I think it's also this idea of you know, when I said that he shouldn't, well, I wanted him to be king, but he didn't become king, and he transcended that. I think very likely he just had the insight, like this is how it has to go.
No, but I think he's completely at a loss at the moment. The insight is coming up right now.
So it wasn't there, but you're
Oh
saying,
yeah,
so you're
almost
saying that the moment he made the prediction, he didn't have the insight. Is that what you're saying?
at the moment he made the prediction. He is struggling.
Okay.
These are not hard predictions. This is a man who's struggling with his calling and what the pattern of his calling is.
Mm,
Is the
yeah.
pattern of his calling to be a victorious rebel and slay the Romans and restore the kingdom of Israel? Or is there a different pattern available in the prophecies that could say, no, you're going to die, but you're going to nevertheless contribute. And that is, of course, the righteous servant. And him being aware of Psalms and Isaiah and perhaps other stuff, he is working his way through these stories. And if you take, for instance, the theories of Hjalmar Sundén, I think it's 50 years old now, about religious people living in stories, that's beautiful psychological material to evaluate what kind of stuff could have been going on with Jesus,
Yeah.
toying with these different
Yeah.
patterns that come from his narrative world.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay.
Okay, so now we're moving up the mountain, and somehow he knows that he has to pray, and he brings some of his friends up, and the rest he leaves behind. And then this story is weird because it's a mystical experience on the mountain. And the weird stuff about it is that his friends co-experience the story, but not exactly like he is experiencing it. And they come to the description that it is Moses and Elijah that are talking to him, the lawgiver of Israel and the great prophet of later Israel during the
Oh,
Muslim.
that's cool. That's like a crazy, like they're like the symbols of combined reality. They're like, you know,
Yeah,
almost like Mary and John, you know, this type of, yeah.
absolutely.
It
So
could have
basically,
been,
this is all of Israel. This is the law and the
yeah,
prophet. This is
beautiful.
all of your tradition. This is everything that Sundane would say is going through your head is going through your head there. And these are the words that they give to it. And it's like there's a light and he participates in that light. It's almost like a near-death experience that he's having, or your ayahuasca stuff. So he is experiencing a different reality, and his friends are co-experiencing part of it, but not in full understanding. And then one gospel, the Gospel of Luke, says they were speaking with him about his exodus in Jerusalem. Now, exodus means going out of Egypt, of course, going out of slavery, going out of this oppressive situation. In Jerusalem means he's going up to Jerusalem, basically to face the heat. He fled the country, but following this experience, he will return to Jerusalem. And in the Gospel of Mark, this is really the turning point of the Gospel. He's now at the upper limit of the geography of Mark, and he's turning around. And I think in Luke it says he made his face stone hard in order to be able to face reality and move back and face the heat in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Now remember, we're not so far from that experience at the lake where we had green grass, which was spring. So we're a bit later, so perhaps we're in summer now, and Eastern is still far away. We still need to cover about 9 months or something before we return to Jerusalem. He comes from that experience, on that mystical experience on the mountain, and when he descends, it's a beautiful scene. One of the Italian painters, I think Raphael, made a beautiful picture of how he then descends on the moonstruck boy with his father.
Mm.
Now, this is very interesting because coming from above, speaking about the Son of Man needs to die, but he will be raised up. He requires faith in his Father to be raised up. Remember that we started with, it's the faith of Jesus. That's the pattern of redemption.
Yeah.
So he needs the faith of his Father, his heavenly Father, to be able to face death. You
Yeah.
see, symbolic, we are already in the Gospel of Mark. It's very symbolic. And then when he comes down the mountain, then there is this father and this son, and there is a lot of people, and there are his disciples, and they're all quarreling, and they are not able to cure the son, who's moonstruck, epileptic, and he would froth at the mouth, fall into the fire, etc. So this is a really bad situation. And then Jesus comes there and he is immediately utterly tired. And you can imagine he's just been confronted with a vision about what his calling might be, which might be to die in Jerusalem, to just trust his Father for the rest of it. I'm not saying we're talking about physical resurrection yet. I'm not talking about the particular resurrection of Jesus yet, but to trust his Father in the face of death.
Yeah.
And know that life goes on and that he will be part of the resurrection, which was a common belief under large groups of Jews.
Resurrection?
Resurrection of the dead in general. Not every Jew believed that. There are different opinions among the Jews, but a large group, including most of the Pharisees, including Paul, including the friends of Jesus, believed in some sort of physical resurrection.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Okay.
Okay.
That's a general resurrection, or a resurrection of Israel, or the bones of Israelites, etc.
Yeah.
So that's you can go to, for instance, the archaeology of Dura Europos,
Yeah, I know this one. It's
and
really
there is
cool.
a synagogue,
Yeah,
and
it's
the
beautiful.
whole story of preaching in Ezekiel, preaching to the bones that the Spirit of God will come and that the bones will be covered with flesh again, and that they will return to Israel. That whole thing is in that synagogue. It's a beautiful expression of the belief in the physical resurrection, if it's a belief in the physical resurrection, because as we said, archaeology is still
Yeah,
historical. This is
exactly.
not an exact science. But anyway,
Yeah.
so we move back, and this father is here, and then we get to the key. Then he says, "Can you cure him? Can you heal my son?" And then Jesus says something very weird. He says, "Can I cure him? Everything is possible for him who has faith." Now, some translators, especially the newer translation here in the Netherlands, sort of make that into just believe in me and I will cure him. But that's not what the reaction is from the Father. The Father says, I have faith, but please help me in my unbelief. I believe, please help me in my unbelief, my lack of faith. So basically, he takes up the role of the man who is responsible to heal his son.
Yeah.
He's the faith carrier. And he is, in a way, because he brings his son to be made whole. And Jesus heals the son. There's some story about that, about the reaction of the demon, etc. But it says that the son then was lying as if he was dead, and he was raised from the dead. So now all of a sudden we have a father here who has to believe that his son can be healed, who has a son who dies and who is resurrected from the dead. So you see how much symbolism is already involved.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It's all in the text.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And
amazing.
is this because of the previous experience that it is experienced now as an enactment of what happened in that mystical experience on the mountain? Is that sort of the filter through which this event
Yeah.
was retold and retold and cast into words?
Yeah. 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 That's cool. That's a really cool idea.
Now, of course, that would make the Father, we get somewhere, God.
Yeah.
Jesus would have to know that this Father cared so much about his son that he would not leave him, but would want to see him made whole.
Yeah.
So Jesus is testing his Father. He's testing his faith in his Father. He's testing his Father's faith and loyalty to him, to the Son. And I was thinking, am I completely mad now? Am I blaspheming again? Am I doing it? So I was going into one of the older manuscripts, which is in Dublin. And I had been invited to speak on a conference with dogmatists, like theologians that study the development of dogma. And I said, well, can I bring this to them? I didn't know. Was I irresponsible of doing
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And then I went through this manuscript. They're all online. And then you know the nomina sacra.
Yes.
It's a
Well,
practice in
go
old
ahead.
manuscripts to put a line across
Yeah.
a name of something sacred,
Yes.
often the name of God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit, and then you can abbreviate it.
Yeah. 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 Like in
You know those
Coptic.
names.
In Coptic, they use it a lot.
They use that a lot.
Yeah.
So what happens to the father in this story?
Tell me.
Not pater, it is PTR with a line across it.
Ah, that's
Now,
crazy.
that can just be the scribe who is doing what he always does when he meets the word father. Da, 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 let's go on.
Yeah.
It could also mean a conscious decision of, hey, this father has godlike features here, father-like features here.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
it could just be me having luck. And before going to a conference, I have this serendipitous moment of giving me courage to actually put this interpretation onto the
That's
gospel.
so cool. How did people respond to it?
That was a lovely meeting, and I tried to have them ask to have them interrogate the text on different levels. On the level of a fisherman telling the story, on the level of a gospel writer doing it, and on the level of someone today. How can you relate to the story? Because as biblical scholars, we're very much literary, so we want to see the engagement between the reader and the text, and what kind of world is it building, and what kind of suppositions do you bring to the text, and what do you do when you do that on different levels of the development of that text.
Yeah.
So that was big fun. It was a very nice meeting. So, but now we have a Jesus that sort of has the conviction that he is to die in Jerusalem to benefit his people. So you see this very great explanation later on for what we read in the letters of Paul. Hey, Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Christ. He came to die for our sins. Wow, we just saw all of that happening.
Yeah.
We have a relatively materialist explanation to take the text in Paul seriously and to understand how then these stories in the Gospels came to take shape, both on a symbolical level and a historical level. I cannot be certain of anything, of any of this. It's just my imagination trying to come up with a reading that produces all these results.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. So let's move on in the story
Well, let's
as we
okay.
get
So we can
closer.
also save ourselves a little bit of time and move to the resurrection.
I'm kind of in the story. Like,
You're
if
in the
you if
story now.
yeah, I'm in the story. I'd like to continue it.
Okay. So now it gets hard because we are in a story in summer, and we have now the most symbolic time to die is like the Passover lamb on Easter.
Yeah.
Most theologians read this in the Gospel of John and think it's a Johannine innovation that Jesus dies as a Passover lamb. But if I'm correct that this understanding of Jesus that he would die comes from the summer and it actually waits until the Passover feast, and that he then purposefully exposes himself to the authorities, then it might be a symbolic act,
Mm,
a reenactment of the Exodus story, just like
yeah.
Gospel of Luke is saying. Yeah. So what happens now? Well, we get a number of stories that are sort of that he's sort of playing hide and seek. And a very interesting story follows in the Gospel of John, where it's the Festival of Booths in autumn. And his brothers who do not believe in him, it says, his brothers who do not believe in him, say, why aren't you not in Jerusalem? If you're such a big message to tell the people, why are you not where the people are? Go
Yeah.
to Jerusalem, go there. So they're mocking him. They don't believe he is the Messiah. They don't believe he is anything else than their brother, their slightly weird brother, religiously wacko brother.
That's so crazy. Yeah.
Then, of course, Jesus goes to Jerusalem, but later, after that, the crowds have left.
Mm,
He can sort of play hide and seek. And then he appears in among the people in Jerusalem, but always with a lot of followers and crowds, and always there is this possibility of riots if they would arrest him. So they never arrest him, but he needs to get out, get in, get out, etc. It even says that for a while he found a refuge in the Gospel of John. It is in the mountains of Judea, and it says he goes back towards the Galilee before he goes on his final journey. And that is an interesting moment, because at that point in time, we have this beautiful story of mothers bringing their children. So Jesus is taking leave of his family and friends, and they want him to bless their children as well. So is he sharing already that's going to be crunch time? Of course, that's not in the story in the Gospels as we have it. It's just a story of don't hinder the children, let them come to me, because you can't enter the kingdom unless you're like one of them. But perhaps at this point in time, he is preparing for his final journey. In the meantime, we've seen a few other stories pass by, like the Lazarus story, like Jesus passing by Jerusalem and says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I wanted to gather you in? Like a chicken would gather her chicks, but you have not allowed me to. There's very much, there's this melancholy. And my mission has failed. I have not been able to inspire Israel to embrace God's kingdom.
Wait, can you quickly talk about Lazarus before we continue?
Yeah, well, Lazarus is a difficult story because it's only in the Gospel of John. So from a literary criticism point of view, historical criticism point of view, it's difficult to see if anything there is based in historical reality. I wouldn't mind imagining a story that could be based in historical reality, but I have far less to work with than
that I understand,
because the crossing of the water is in all the Gospels, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence that I can use.
But why is it there? Why is Lazarus there, you think?
Okay, so what we do find earlier in the stories is that Jesus more often went to Jerusalem than just once. So the little village of Bethany, where they live, has a Lazarus, has a previous encounter with a Simon, who is either a teacher of the law or a leper, or as a Jewish scholar once suggested, the leper is a misreading of the Hebrew for an Essene. And we know that some of the Essenes lived in towns, but in an unmarried state. And Lazarus and his sisters lived together in that town. It would be fun to actually explore an Essene connection here. We don't have anything to be certain about, so it's just imagination. Okay? But the first time that Jesus is there, you've got the story with the sinner, the woman who is a sinner, whatever her sin is, but I would assume she is a prostitute, who breaks her flask with the anointing oil. And then it's asked whether or not Jesus understands what kind of woman is at his feet. That is a very interesting story, because later on, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, does something similar when she knows that Jesus is going to die. That's the very last time that they move through the village of Bethany. They do it at the healing of Lazarus, and then he is holding out across the river Jordan, and he's afraid of entering Jerusalem. And Thomas actually says, okay, let's go there, then go to Lazarus, go and get killed, get arrested, get killed. So this whole political tension is still there. But he goes into Bethany, and later on is this last visit when they have finally taken leave of family and friends, go down for the Passover, and then they go through it again. And then Mary, the sister of Lazarus, repeats the story with the anointing. And then, of course, you have the story that some of the disciples are angry. For instance, Judas, stories told slightly different in the different Gospels. But it comes down to, we could have used that for the poor, and Jesus says, yes, but she did it for my burial, to prepare me for my burial. So there is an interesting, there are interesting connections between something might be going on in Bethany. So let's not immediately assume that this is made up from whole cloth and then just put into the gospel as a story that didn't exist. So yeah, there might be something there.
Okay. Okay, let's go back then, or at least let's continue, because you skipped over Lazarus, and then where are we?
So following the festival of Booth, following the visit to Lazarus, we get back to the Galilee. We have the blessing of the children, and Jesus is on his final journey to Jerusalem, going to Jericho, through Jericho, and then into the city of Jerusalem. And then it's interesting. The first thing he does is to expose himself to the authorities by taking a whip, or making a whip, and then turning the tables of the money changers and the sellers of sacrificial victims, like doves. Yeah. So that's interesting. So he's exposing himself to the authorities. He said, come and get me. Now, of course, that doesn't fit with the idea that
No.
that Jesus was insignificant and that the Romans just happened to have killed him because it was an awkward guy. No, it seems that he is actually enacting what he learned on that mountain, that he would confront once more, one last time, and that he would call for the purification of the temple. And it's an interesting thing that it's the purification of the temple, because we remember one of the most certain things was the gospel was that John the Baptist was his teacher, and
Yeah.
John's thinking is associated in the study about John the Baptist with the prophet Malachi. And Malachi is all about purifying the temple. So this might be one for John. It's still the same line. God
It
is
seems
speaking.
the spirit of John coming out of him. Yeah.
John is still there.
Yeah.
And in that period, Jesus has his Last Supper. Now, remember that we talked about his death in Jerusalem as an exodus. The Last Supper is a celebration, as it reads, of a Jewish Passover meal, except without the lamb. Interesting. But it reads like that. And Jesus actually takes on the role of the lamb in that Last Supper. Is that all theology? Well, not if he is actually consciously reenacting all of this. If he goes to Jerusalem on purpose for the Passover in order to confront the authorities with the idea that it might kill him, that he is doing that to purify the temple, and that he is now showing himself to be the Passover lamb, that could all be symbolic language to prepare his followers for his death.
Yeah.
We're still not at the resurrection, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So now we get the crucifixion. Very interesting, but let's skip a few beats here, and then let's go to the resurrection. Because you asked, can we know whether or not Jesus was risen from the dead? Huh?
Well, the way I think I posed it was that I think that based on the historical evidence, even my teachers who are teaching in a secular university were like, he was seen.
Yes.
So that's what I'm asking you to speak about. Yeah.
Yeah, but that sort of that whole discussion, that's really did a miracle happen and therefore we have to believe Jesus? We have to believe we become Christians. And I don't think that's the message here. The message is here that someone trusted God so much that he could confront the authorities in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And something happened that was so profound that his followers were able to do the same
Yeah. Yes.
years that were coming.
Yes.
That is what we need to explain. See, again, I'm not trying to prove that Jesus rose from the dead or not. I'm trying to come up with a story that could explain why so many of his followers were able to do marvelous things and stand up against kings and governors.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Now, what did Jesus believe when he was being crucified? Did he believe that he would set his clock and Sunday morning he would rise from the dead?
No.
How do we know he didn't believe that?
Well, I think it almost has to be that way. So I no, I don't know, but
Is there a clue as to what his followers could have thought?
I'm not sure. I feel that maybe some of his followers uh, were against, and I don't know the story well enough to say, but that they didn't want him to do this, to go through with it.
Yeah, Judas, for instance, uh, thought that his actions would lead to perhaps war or sedition, and he betrayed him. He thought Jesus was on the wrong path. Now, what's actually most interesting, and not even in the letters of Paul, is the story about the women at the grave on Sunday morning. The testimony of women, unfortunately, was not taken very seriously in antiquity in general. And here it's the same. So the fact that these stories about the women are in there leads many theologians to believe that there probably was a story about women at the grave, that was probably at the core of it. It's not something that you would come up with far later. In fact, the whole testimony of the women is not in the letters of Paul to the Corinthians. Now, and the weird thing is, these women brought spices to embalm his body. They did not expect him to be raised up on the third day.
yes, that's interesting. Yeah,
They thought that he
good
would still
point.
be grave.
Yeah,
So the whole thing about putting guards in front of the grave was to prevent his body from being stolen.
mm,
They thought that they could ask for permission to embalm his body, as it was customary. And now the customs around a body from someone who dies a violent death are different from other bodies. So there's a lot of stuff to know if you want to go into the historical details again. But let's leave that out for the moment, and let's just first assume that these women did not expect him to be alive. And worse, when they came back to the disciples, they thought they were crazy.
the
They
disciples thought they
didn't.
were crazy.
Yes, they said this is old women's tales. This is rubbish. You cannot believe that. And then some of them came running, and then we have these later apparitions. So the whole atmosphere is not like, oh, Jesus said that he would die, that he would be risen on the third day. Then he died, and then on the third day they were all sitting waiting for the spectacle to happen. Nobody was there.
Yeah,
Nobody believed he would be resurrected. Was that because they didn't take Jesus seriously? Or does it tell us something that the way that it is described now in retrospect, it is far more certain, like, hey, I will be raised on the third day, than it was going to the event?
yeah,
Now, interesting, if you read Schweitzer, there's a good possibility that Jesus did not identify himself as the Lord that would return from the heavens, but rather as one of the people who would be in the general resurrection when the Lord himself, God, descends as the ruler of the world. So he would be part of the general resurrection rather than his own particular resurrection. That could be an explanation that explains what we see in the sources. So there was talk about being part of the resurrection, that was acceptable to his thinking. So Jesus did understand himself, and then there is this text in Hosea that says, after 2 or 3 days, God revives us again, even if he kills us. So there's play around that number, but it didn't amount to any firm expectation with his followers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the reason why I said that it almost has to be that way, also for him, I think, is that if you already know that you'll be, resurrected in like 2 days, then there's something about um, your path of suffering that seems a bit less genuine, if you know what I mean.
Seems like very cheap, huh?
Yeah, it seems like, yeah, well, I know I'm gonna be resurrected, so that's why I'm doing this. And it's still, the pain is, of course, very real, but
I think he trusted God to be carried even in his death, and this is also why it's so poignant that this psalm text is put on his lips, that he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
yeah,
This is the real suffering, psychological suffering that we see here, like the loss of all hope, almost.
exactly. That's a good one, and it's a good line.
And I think that Jesus wanted to be faithful, even if he was not 100% certain that God would be faithful to him.
Yeah, yeah, that rings true.
And that faith, even when you're not certain, is the exact same faith as the Father at the bottom of that mount that says, I believe, but help me in my unbelief.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. I can see it.
And that's the same faith that you and I share. I want to believe this. I desperately want to believe this, but help me, please, because it's hard to.
Yeah,
But yet I will act as if I am certain.
yeah,
Faith will be proven by what I do, by my acts, not by my mind, not by my heart that's anxious and distressed, not by my soul. It will be proven by the fact that I act faithfully. And that's where you started with. There is, among scholars, there is a very clear consensus among most scholars, just like you said about your teachers, that the friends of Jesus believed that they had experienced him alive. There's some debate whether or not they believed that they had experienced him in a physical sense or in the spiritual sense. But they were able, from their perspective, to combine the two and to
yeah,
believe in the physical resurrection of the body of Jesus. But the fact that they experienced him alive is, in my mind, historical bedrock.
mm,
Without it, you cannot explain what we see happening in the first century. They experienced him alive in different circumstances, etc., etc., etc. So if someone's unable to believe in the physical resurrection, I say, who cares? It's the impact of Jesus that is clearly visible in that first century, and that is still an impact today. And people still experience him as being alive. And I don't know if they're projecting just God into that or what have you. And I don't care if that's really the case, because I'm not a dogmatist. I'm studying the sources. So I don't care that much about how you explain it. But there is this historical reality that is very encouraging for faith today. That is that people were saved by the faith of Jesus.
yeah, and that's undeniable.
Yeah.
Well, then that's a beautiful spot to end. Thank you. That was really fun.
Okay.
I really liked it, and your enthusiasm has always been there, and you still carry it with you. So it's
Okay.
appendix alerts. Take it away.
Yep. Yeah, I was thinking the question now, of course, arises: do you or do you not believe yourself in the resurrection of Jesus?
Do you?
As a believer, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I don't know what it means, but I wholeheartedly believe it and I act upon it.
And the I don't know what it means seems essential.
Yeah. So, but that's no, I don't know what it means, but I trust that it means that he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
body sort of transfigured. That's what I trust that it means. I don't know if it means that, but that's not the job of a biblical scholar to tell people what to believe. But it is my job if people say he was never raised from the dead, or he was, to say, okay, but what are you doing? What are you trying to explain? And remember, we said we have to explain why things happen in the letters of Paul or in the Gospels, but first the letters of Paul as they are older. And whatever you say must explain that. So what's your explanation that people believe that he was raised from the dead, that they did so in different circumstances, and that they drove them forward, etc. And we've built a story now that explains a lot of that. And then the most simple explanation. So we need something that explains it. Then we need something plausible, and then we need the most simple one, the most efficient one. Remember, those were the criteria.
Yep.
If he rose from the dead, that scores high on a explanation because that explains exactly what's written down there. So if it happened, you understand why it was written down.
Yep.
In terms of plausibility, we get this huge disconnect between believers and unbelievers. The believers who believe that God can work miracles have no problem with him being raised from the dead, but those who are materialists says that that's not going to happen. So that's where it's killed. And then, of course, you've got efficiency of the explanation. And now, all of a sudden, I'm not ready to just say, because it can't happen, we're done talking. Those who do not believe need to come up with different explanations for what we see, for what we need to explain. And those different explanations then have to be efficient. Hopefully, the most efficient one will win. And then you can compare that with the rather, for them, implausible explanation that Jesus did rise from the dead. I cannot solve this for anyone, because it's the plausibility problem between believers and unbelievers that kills the equation. But we can have a honest talk about what people think, how they can explain what they see in the letters of Paul. And I think that's a worthwhile thing. And it's always good to listen to each other and to understand what really matters for you, for your life today, then bringing this forward.
Yeah.
I would say you can be a Christian, a follower of Jesus, following in his faith, even if you cannot believe in a physical resurrection. That's what I wanted to add.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Appendix 2.